Vayihi Beshalach Paro es ha'am v'lo nacham Elohim derech eretz Pelishtim ki karohu ki amar Elohim pen yinnachem ha'am bir'osam milchama v'shavu mitzrayma vayasev Elohim es ha'am derech hamidbar yamsuf v'chamushim olu v'nei Yisrael me'eret Mitzrayim.
Our weekly parasha is called Beshalach, and it starts with Exodus chapter 13, verse 17, where it says, "Now when Pharaoh had let the people go," even the stronger sense here in this verb shalach, the Pharaoh just sent his people away. In other words, after the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh had to really bow down before the Lord. And they left. And it says here that in verse 21, the Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way, in a pillar of fire by night to give them light that they might travel by day and by night. Interestingly enough, it says here, the Lord was going in a pillar of fire and a pillar of clouds in Exodus 13, but in Exodus 14, verse 19, it says, the angel of God who had been going before the camp. We can see here how the Lord and the angel of God is used interchangeably during the time of Exodus to demonstrate who was going before the camp of Israel in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. The people of Israel were following that guidance, and the pillar somehow started to swerve down south. On the one hand, it was justifiable, as the Torah portion explains. The only way from Egypt to the land of Israel was on the north side of the Mediterranean, through the Suez, through the area where now we have Suez Canal. However, this particular area was at this time populated by so-called sea people, the Philistines. We discussed before that the word Plishtim, which is in English Philistines, means the conqueror. And somehow, particularly, this southeastern corner of Mediterranean attracted all kinds of conquerors during the course of history. And particularly these Philistines, they're called the people of the sea, are mentioned in Egyptian sources. Possibly they have moved across Mediterranean from the Greek islands, particularly the island of Crete, and they settled in the area where today infamous Gaza Strip is located. But basically by settling there, they were known for their aggressiveness and militance, and they were given lots of troubles to Egypt, but they in fact blocked the passage, which was the only way, the only possible passage on a dry land between the continent of Africa and the continent of Asia. This is why God wanted to avoid the direct encounter with the well-armed militant troops of Philistines, and he decided to move south. But what would happen down on the south? Down on the south, there is no connecting point between the continent of Asia and Africa. Down south, people of Israel ended up at the shore of the sea, on the beach. And today, the landscape of that area south of the Sinai Peninsula and the south side of the Sinai Gulf of Suez is very well known for its hills and valleys. In other words, the mountain ranges with the Rocky Mountains are coming straight toward the sea, and they are intertwined with the passageways, flat passageways. This is why the people of Israel were going this direction where the pillar of fire and pillar of cloud led them, and they passed in between the mountain ranges, and they ended up right at the beach, and that was it. This is why when Pharaoh received the information about such a thing, he rejoiced. And it says that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he gathered 600 chariots. That was a perfect catch for the Pharaoh. The Egyptian army was based on its chariotry because it was really a mighty power. Of course, it was very tricky in its tactics because the chariot can actually work very well on a flat ground. The chariot was a mighty weapon and a very expensive. It was about like 3 to 5 feet wide, two-wheeled cart. Out of the barrel of the wheel, there were about 3 feet in each direction, sharp objects, knives and axes and all kinds of things. And the chariots in this fashion would line up in one front line, and they would attack. Of course, if tactically it is possible to do such a thing and to line up the chariots, there was only one defense which was used in ancient time. They would take a female horse, a mare, in the heat, and they would just run this mare in front of the chariots, and of course the chariots were driven by the stallions, and the line of the chariots would mess up. Well, Israelites didn't have the mares. They had only sheep and goats and some large cattle, so they were out of luck. And they were really locked inside the trap, because the 600 chariots would specifically create a width of about a mile wide, which was the distance between the mountain ranges. We don't know exactly where it happens, but the landscape of that southwestern shore of the Gulf of Suez is known for hills and valleys, and the distance between two mountain ranges could be about 1 mile, so there was no escape route whatsoever. This is why the people of Israel started to cry to the Moses. And they said in verse 11 of chapter 14, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt?" This is a very, very bad attitude. First of all, it wasn't Moses who did it. Second of all, why in the world God has made all these miracles? We talked about the God thinking about the global impact of these miracles which he did in Egypt. And in fact, they did have a global impact, as we can see in the book of Joshua, where Rahab, the harlot, talks to the spies and says, oh, when this happened, we really were shaken. But for the people of Israel, in a time of distress, it seemed to be that their memory was really short. Well, this is really what happens with all of us. We like to experience the boost of energy with all kinds of miracles, healings on a stage, all kinds of shows put up by some people today. But when we come to our daily lives and we are faced with the daily difficulties, we got problems. We immediately forget about all good things God has done in our lives. We remind ourselves of a little sparrow, which is in a story when I read it in my childhood. A little boy finds a sparrow with a clipped wing, and he tries to save this little sparrow, and the sparrow sees the boy, and of course the sparrow sees this huge monster with a huge teeth, and he thinks, oh, he's gonna eat me. And then the boy takes him into his hands carefully and carries him home, and doesn't eat the sparrow, but the sparrow keeps thinking, oh, he's probably not hungry. He will eat me tomorrow. Well, the boy takes the sparrow and brings him into a little cage and gives him the water and gives him some breadcrumbs and grains. And the sparrow is eating and thinking, oh, maybe this monster thinks I am too skinny, and that's why he gives me food for me to fatten up before he eats me. Sometimes we think about God when we get into the difficult situation like this. And this is what was the problem there. And this is why God, when he hears this and hears Moses' prayer in verse 15 of chapter 14, says to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. That is what unfortunately sometimes lacks in our walk with God. But God expected the people of Israel to trust him completely. And when those who carried out those who were in the head of the large group started to walk, the pillar of cloud and fire started to walk through the sea, and the people started to follow him. This crossing of the Red Sea causes lots of doubts among the liberal scholars. There are many excuses found to avoid this story because it's so unusual. Nothing like this has ever happened before. And that's why they came to some interpretation that that the Yam Suf, the Red Sea, is actually the Sea of Reed, which is actually the lake which is on that place where right now Suez Canal is. Well, the impossibility of this is obvious. The very reason why God led people down south is to avoid the encounter with the Philistines, which were right there. Second of all, the lake does not present an impossible obstacle. Why would the people of Israel stop right at the lake and wouldn't just pass around it? And the third argument, of course, is why would Pharaoh, if they were going on a straight way and just veered toward the lake, why would he think that they got lost in the desert? No, this was definitely out of ordinary. And when Moses stretches out his hand over the sea, the Lord sweeps the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turns the sea into a dry land. So the waters are divided. Those who tried to explain it through the lake think that it was a wind and the earthquake, and that what created that what caused the waters of the lake to move southwards. It is not what the text says here. The text says that the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on a dry land, and the waters were like wool to them on their right hand and on their left hand. This is why this miracle is unique. And there was never anything like this in the history before that or after that. Well, it was a similar event, I should point out, when people of Israel crossed Jordan. And it was done specifically because God wanted to remind the people of Israel about the experience of the previous generation and what was happening with the Egyptian army. It says here in verse 25 that God caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. What was happening? Because one of the biggest objections is that the number of people was so big that how could they escape so fast? But we know what happened. We know that God gave the time by sending the fog. His pillar of cloud actually stood between the Israel camp and the Egyptian camp. On the one hand, it would take some time for the 600 chariots to line up in the perfect front attacking order. But on the other hand, the cloud was very obvious there. We know about the dust storms and hamsins. Now we know it because of some history from the two Iraq wars, that the entire American troops with all their equipment were paralyzed for a couple days and couldn't move in such a weather condition. If such a weather condition can stop the American troops from advancing to Baghdad, how more so an Egyptian chariotry with no technology could be stopped by the cloud and the dust storm. And that gave some time, because we have the foggy condition and plus the east wind. That's exactly what creates the dust, what causes the dust rise from the ground. And this is exactly what was happening. And that's what made the Egyptian chariotry pinned down for a time. Of course, when the dust settled, the weather did not become clear at the moment. But the Egyptian warriors and their commanders could see clearly some kind of movement. And they didn't realize where this movement was, because there was some distance, and of course they didn't have any binoculars or any other optical observation technique, so they could not clearly determine the distance, but they saw some movement, and they gave the command to attack. Of course, while the chariotry was going on in between the two mountain ranges, the surface was absolutely perfect, because it was even going downhill, which in turn allows for the chariots to be able to accelerate to up to 30 or 35 miles an hour. Of course, the horses don't have brake pedals. So when the horses approached the beach and entered into the bottom of the sea, they didn't stop running. But the surface indeed changed, because the bottom of the Red Sea is full of sharp rocks and coral reefs. And of course, with no shock absorbers, with no tires, and with wooden wheels, attempt to drive on sharp corals with a speed of 35 miles an hour wasn't really a comfortable ride. This is what the text means, that God caused the wheels to swerve. The chariot order really fell apart, and I can imagine that the number of the chariot drivers just couldn't hold tight sitting in these carts, and they were literally flying off those carts when the carts bumped across these rocks. This was a big mess, a mess in which God was glorified. It gave sufficient time for all people of Israel to walk across the Gulf of Suez, which is probably in this area about 10, 15 miles wide. And when the chariotry realized that they cannot move forward and attempted to pull back, the waters have closed, swallowing the entire Egyptian army, the might of 600 chariots, which was a strong economic impact. In World War II, after Pearl Harbor, when the United States lost its battleship fleet, it took several years to rebuild it. And for Japan, which didn't have enough industrial strength, the loss of their aircraft carrier fleet at the Battle of Midway was fatal. They could not rebuild them. The same way with the chariotry. It is not a cheap project to build one chariot, not speaking about the 600. And this is why the entire world, particularly the people of Canaan, were impressed as we read before the words of Rahab the harlot. The fear and trembling of the Lord God of Israel fell upon the residents and the kings of Canaan. This way we can see why God was acting the way he was acting. As we spoke before, the chance of a peaceful takeover the land of Israel, according to the promise that God gave to Abraham, was lost because of the action of Shimon and Levi. Now God is given to his people the second chance. It is true that God made the Passover the new beginning for the people of Israel. And this is why this song of Moses follows the defeat of the Pharaoh. Interestingly enough, the same structure is found in the book of Judges, which is proposed for this weekly Haftarah by the rabbis. We see the defeat of the Canaanite king Jabin before the sons of Israel. The circumstances are somewhat similar. When this king had a massive chariotry, he decided to use it in the valley of Jezreel, which was flat and well suited for the chariot battles. And how God was able to help Dvorah and Barak, and the chariotry went into the area under the Mount Tabor where it was swampy and stuck there. And after this defeat, Dvorah and Barak are singing the song. This is why Judges chapter 4 and 5 are suggested as a matching haftarah for the Torah portion. As we spoke before, the book of Revelation is also structured around the God's salvation in a time of trouble. And Revelation chapter 15, verses 2 and 3 is suggested for today's reading that match Haftarah and Torah reading, particularly because there is a group of people who stands on a sea of glass and sings the song of Moses. This is the similarity. But besides the song of Moses, they also sing the song of the Lamb. Because God did not use only Moses to save his people from Egyptian bondage. Before the killing of the firstborn, he made everybody stop and contemplate on eating the lamb. And this is why at the end of time, the saved ones sing both songs at the same time. The song of Moses, which indicates the leadership of this great prophet, and the song of Lamb, which did the ultimate substitutionary salvation. Great and marvelous are your works, O Lord God Almighty. Righteous and true are your ways, King of the nation. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy, and for all the nation will come to worship before you, for your righteousness have been revealed.